Sometimes love finds you in the most impossible places, against all odds and against all rules. Sometimes the heart chooses before the mind can understand the consequences. In 9th century Norway, a giant Viking warrior named Stenr returns to his village with a pregnant woman named Freya. The village laughs and mocks them because Freya is his half-sister. But Stenr and Freya were separated at birth and raised in different clans. They fell in love before they knew they shared blood. Their love was built on survival and loyalty, not family ties. Now the whole village wants them punished. What will happen when their forbidden love threatens to destroy everything they know? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the breath of sleeping gods, and through it walked a man whose very presence seemed to part the grey curtain of dawn. Stenr Hjalmarsson stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of countless battles and the scars that marked him as one who had danced with death and lived to tell the tale. His auburn beard, braided with silver rings earned through valor, caught the first rays of sunlight as he approached the wooden gates of Grimhalt. At his side walked Freya, her golden hair woven with small bones and feathers in the tradition of her birth clan, the Ironhold. Her belly, round with child, pushed against the folds of her woolen dress, and her hand rested protectively over the life growing within. Around her neck hung a pendant carved from reindeer bone, a wolf's head with eyes that seemed to watch the world with ancient wisdom. It had been her mother's, and her mother's mother before that, passed down through generations of women who had loved fiercely and paid dearly for it. The village of Grimhalt, nestled in a valley where 2 rivers met, its long houses built from the bones of great ships that had carried warriors across distant seas. Smoke rose from cooking fires, mingling with the salt air that carried whispers of adventure and conquest. This was a place where strength determined worth, where the weak served the strong, and where bloodlines traced back to gods and giants mattered more than gold. Stenr's war axe, bloodbane, hung at his side, a weapon forged by his grandfather's grandfather, its twin blades darkened by the blood of enemies whose names had been forgotten by time. The handle, worn smooth by generations of calloused hands, bore runic inscriptions that told of victories in lands so distant they might as well have been other worlds. This axe had never known defeat, and neither had the man who wielded it. "They're watching us already," Freya murmured, her voice carrying the musical accent of the northern clans. Her green eyes, bright as spring grass, caught the movement of curtains in the windows of the nearest longhouse. "Can you feel their stares?" Stenr's jaw tightened, but his pace never slowed. "Let them watch. Let them whisper. We have done nothing that requires shame." But even as he spoke those words, the weight of their situation pressed upon his chest like a stone. 3 moons ago, their world had been simpler. 3 moons ago, he had been merely a war chief returning from a successful raid, and she had been the woman who had captured his heart during the long winter they had spent surviving together in the wilderness. 3 moons ago, they had not known the truth that now hung between them like an invisible chain. Elder Astrid emerged from the great hall, her walking stick tapping against the worn stones of the courtyard. At 70 winters, she had buried 3 husbands and outlived most of her enemies, her grey hair still thick enough to braid, and her eyes sharp enough to pierce a man's soul. She had been present at Stenr's birth, had helped deliver him into this world of blood and iron, and now she stood as judge of the path he had chosen. "Stenr Hjalmarsson," she called, her voice carrying the authority of decades. "You return to us changed. I return as I left. Elder, a man who keeps his word and protects those under his care." Astrid's gaze shifted to Freya, taking in the swell of her belly, the protective way Stenr's massive hand rested on her lower back, the defiance that burned in both their eyes like twin flames. "And this woman, this Ironhold daughter who carries your seed, this is Freya, daughter of—" "I know whose daughter she is," Astrid interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried farther than a shout. "The question, young chief, is whether you know." Before Stenr could respond, Bjorn the blacksmith emerged from his forge, his leather apron still smouldering from the morning's work. He was a mountain of a man, nearly as large as Stenr himself, with arms that could bend iron and a heart that had never learned to bend at all. Behind him came his wife, Solveig, whose tongue was sharper than any blade Bjorn had ever forged. "Well, well," Solveig called out, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Look what the tide washed up. The great war chief returns with a belly-heavy woman in tow. Tell us, Stenr, did you find her wandering lost in the woods, or did you steal her from her clan like a common raider?" Freya stepped forward, her chin raised with dignity that spoke of noble birth despite her current circumstances. "I am no one's stolen property, woman. I walk where I choose, with whom I choose. Do you now?" Solveig's laugh was like the caw of a raven. "And does your clan know of your choices? Does Jarl Magnus of the Ironhold know his precious daughter has been playing wife to a Grimhalt warrior?" The mention of Jarl Magnus sent a chill through the growing crowd. Magnus Ironhold was known throughout the Northern Territories as a man who collected debts in blood and never forgot a slight. His daughter's presence here, heavy with another man's child, would be seen as either the gravest insult or an act of war. "My father disowned me the day I chose love over duty," Freya said, her voice steady, despite the tremor Stenr could feel running through her body. "I am no longer his daughter. I am no longer bound by his law." Jarl Eriksson appeared as if summoned by the mention of politics and blood feuds. A man of middle years, with silver threading through his dark hair, he ruled Grimhalt with a careful balance of strength and wisdom. His pale blue eyes missed nothing, and they saw far too much as they moved from Stenr to Freya and back again. "Stenr," he said, his voice measured and careful. "Walk with me." It was not a request. Stenr squeezed Freya's hand gently before following the Jarl toward the great hall. The wooden doors, carved with scenes of great battles and greater victories, seemed to close behind them like the jaws of fate itself. The great hall stretched before them, its timber walls hung with shields and weapons taken from fallen enemies. The smell of mead and wood smoke lingered in the air, mixed with something else, the scent of secrets and difficult conversations. Eriksson poured ale from a horn decorated with silver, offering one to Stenr before settling into his carved chair. 20 years, Eriksson began, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. 20 years you have served this village. 20 years of loyal service, of victories won and enemies defeated. Your name is sung by our skalds, your deeds written in the memory of our people. Stenr remained standing, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Bloodbane's handle. And now you return with a woman whose presence here could start a war we are not prepared to fight. Magnus Ironhold has been looking for an excuse to move against us since his son fell in last summer's border dispute. You hand him that excuse gift-wrapped in his daughter's belly. Freya chose to come here of her own will. She chose to stand beside me when the world told her she should not, did she? Eriksson's eyes narrowed. Or did you seduce her away from her clan for your own purposes? The Magnus I know does not raise daughters who abandon their duties for love. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Stenr felt anger rise in his chest, hot and dangerous, but he forced it down. Anger would not serve Freya now. Only truth could do that, and truth was a luxury they could no longer afford. You want to know the truth, Jarl? Stenr set down his ale untasted. The truth is that love finds us whether we seek it or not. The truth is that sometimes the heart chooses before the mind can understand. The truth is that Freya and I found each other in the wilderness, alone and fighting to survive, and we discovered something worth surviving for. Pretty words, Eriksson said. But words will not stop Magnus's warriors when they come calling. Words will not protect this village when the Ironhold clan decides to take their revenge. Stenr leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the carved table. Then let them come. I've never run from a fight, and I will not start now. But know this, I will not abandon the woman who chose to stand beside me, and I will not abandon the child she carries, even if that choice brings war to your own people. Even then, Eriksson studied him for a long moment, reading the truth written in the scars on Stenr's face and the unwavering steel in his grey eyes. Finally, the Jarl sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. "There are rumors, Stenr, whispers that carry on the wind from the eastern settlements. They say this woman is not just any Ironhold daughter. They say she is Magnus's own blood, raised in his hall, trained in his ways. If that is true, then what you have done is not just dangerous, it is impossible." Outside the hall, Freya sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded protectively over her belly. The carved wolf pendant seemed to grow warm against her skin, as if responding to the tension that filled the air. Around her, the villagers went about their daily tasks, but she could feel their glances like physical touches, could hear the whispered conversations that stopped when she looked their way. She remembered the morning, just 3 moons past, when everything had changed. She had been foraging for herbs in the ruins of an old monastery, searching among the fallen stones for the plants her mother had taught her to find. The scroll had been hidden beneath a loose stone, preserved by some miracle of wind and weather, its ancient parchment still legible despite the years. The genealogy had traced back 7 generations, listing the names and lineages of a dozen different clans. Her finger had traced the lines of descent, following the careful script of some long-dead monk, until she found her own name connected to another by the thin black line that marked shared blood. Stenr Hjalmarsson, son of Hjalm the Bold and Ingrid Ravenkala, brother through their father's wandering youth, to Freya Magnus' daughter, half-siblings, bound by blood they had never known they shared. She had told him that very day, showing him the scroll with hands that shook like autumn leaves. She had watched his face change as understanding dawned, had seen the same devastation in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. But she had also seen something else, a stubborn refusal to let fate dictate their path. "The child needs a father," she whispered to herself now, her hands moving in gentle circles over her belly. "And I need the man I chose, blood or no blood." Bjorn approached from his forge, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he settled beside her on the bench. Despite his wife's sharp tongue, the blacksmith had always been kind to strangers and outcasts, perhaps understanding what it meant to be judged by appearances. "He is a good man," Bjorn said simply. "Stina, I have known him since he was a boy, barely tall enough to lift a sword. He has never broken his word, never abandoned those who depend on him. But," Freya could hear the unspoken reservation in his voice, "but this village has its own needs, its own safety to consider. Love is a fine thing, but it does not stop arrows or turn aside enemy blades. The people here have families, children who need protection." Freya nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that pressed down on everyone in this harsh land. "I never meant to bring danger to your home. If my presence here threatens your people, where would you go?" Bjorn's question was gentle but practical. "Back to your father who has already disowned you? Into the wilderness to birth your child alone? No, girl, running is not the answer. But neither is pretending that difficult choices do not lie ahead." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the village, Freya touched the wolf pendant and thought of her mother dead these 10 years past. What would she have said about this impossible situation? What wisdom would she have offered to a daughter caught between love and law, between heart and blood? The great hall doors opened with a sound like thunder, and Stenr emerged with Jarl Eriksson beside him. Even from a distance, Freya could read the tension in her beloved's shoulders, could see the storm clouds gathering in his grey eyes. Whatever words had been spoken inside that hall, they had not been easy ones. But as Stenr's gaze found hers across the courtyard, she saw something that made her heart sing despite everything. She saw a man who had made his choice and would not be moved from it. She saw the father of her child, the partner of her heart, the one person in all the world who would stand beside her when the whole world stood against them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The torn genealogy scroll lay spread across the rough wooden table in their borrowed quarters, its ancient parchment yellowed with age and torn at the edges where time had worked its patient destruction. Freya's finger traced the delicate lines connecting name to name, generation to generation, following the careful script that some forgotten monk had penned in a monastery that now lay in ruins. "Show me again," Stenr said, his voice rough with something between hope and dread. His massive frame filled the small room, making it seem even smaller. But his hands were gentle as he leaned over the document that had changed everything. Freya pointed to the name written in fading ink near the bottom of the scroll. "Here, Yam the Bold, your father. And here," her finger moved to another line, "the same man, listed as father to a daughter, born to Ragnar Ironhold during a winter of truce between our clans. That would make you your half-sister." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward into silence. Stenr straightened slowly, running his hands through his auburn hair. Outside their small window, the sounds of village life continued. Children playing, women calling to each other across the courtyard, the ring of Bjorn's hammer on anvil. Life went on, unchanged and unchanging, while inside this room their world crumbled and reformed itself into something unrecognizable. "How long have you known?" His question was quiet, but Freya heard the accusation beneath it. 3 moons. "I found this scroll in the ruins of the old monastery while I was searching for medicinal herbs. I've carried it with me since, trying to find the courage to show you. 3 moons. Stenr's laugh held no humor. 3 moons you've known and you said nothing. 3 moons while I planned our future, spoke of marriage, of raising our child together." Freya placed her hands protectively over her belly, where their child, their forbidden child, grew stronger each day. What was I supposed to say? That the gods had played the cruelest joke imaginable? That we had found love only to discover it was built on something the world would never accept? You were supposed to trust me. You were supposed to know that I would find a way. What way? Freya's voice rose, carrying all the anguish of the impossible choice they faced. What way could there be? We are blood, Stenr, half-siblings who fell in love without knowing what we were. There is no path forward that does not lead through shame and exile. Stenr turned to face the window, his broad shoulders blocking out most of the light. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of their lives. There is one path. We choose each other. We choose our child. We choose to make our own way in a world that will never understand. And if the village casts us out, if your own people turn against you, you would give up everything, your position, your honor, your home, for something the world calls sin. Stenr turned back to her, and in his grey eyes she saw the same fierce determination that had carried him through countless battles. I would give up everything for you, for us, for the chance to raise our child free from the shadows of other people's judgments. Before Freya could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their door. The sound was too measured to be casual, too purposeful to be accidental. Someone was coming with news, and in a village where whispers traveled faster than wildfire, news was rarely good. The door opened without ceremony, admitting Elder Astrid with her walking stick tapping against the wooden floor. Behind her came Jarl Eriksson, his face grave, and another figure that made Freya's blood run cold, Thorvald the law speaker, a man whose knowledge of ancient customs and forbidden practices made him both respected and feared. "We must speak," Astrid said without preamble. Her ancient eyes took in the scroll spread across the table, and Freya saw understanding dawn in them like sunrise over dark waters. "It seems the whispers have grown wings." Thorvald stepped forward, his tall, gaunt frame draped in the black robes that marked his calling. His face was carved from sharp angles and deep shadows, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of law and tradition. "Word has reached me of your situation," he said, the pause before the last word heavy with meaning. "There are those who say you have broken the most sacred taboos, that you have brought shame upon both your clans and invited the anger of the gods. And what do you say?" Stenr asked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Bloodbane's handle. "I say that law is law, and tradition is tradition, for reasons that reach back to the dawn of memory. The mixing of close blood has always been forbidden, not from cruelty, but from wisdom. Such unions bring madness, bring weakness, bring the curse of the gods upon whole communities. Freya stepped forward, her chin raised with the dignity of her noble birth. And if we discovered our connection only after love had already taken root, if we learned the truth when it was already too late to undo what had been done. Thorvald's pale eyes studied her with the intensity of a man accustomed to weighing souls. The law does not concern itself with intention, child. It concerns itself with action and consequence. You carry a child whose very existence challenges the natural order. That child is innocent. Stenar's voice cut through the room like a blade. Whatever sins you wish to lay upon us, the child bears no guilt, does it not? Thorvald's smile was thin as winter ice. Tell me, warrior, what becomes of a child born of forbidden blood? What place does such a child have in the world of men? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Freya felt her child stir within her womb, as if responding to the tension that filled the room. She placed both hands over her belly, a gesture both protective and defiant. Our child will have the place we make for it, she said firmly. The love we give it, the strength we teach it, the courage we show it. These things matter more than the circumstances of its birth. Elder Astrid tapped her walking stick against the floor, a sound that commanded attention and silence. Pretty words, child, but the world cares little for pretty words. The world cares for strength, for power, for the approval of the gods. Without these things, love is just another way to starve. Jarl Eriksson had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the careful movements of a man walking through a field of hidden traps. There is another consideration, he said slowly. Magnus Ironhold has sent messengers to the surrounding villages. He seeks his daughter, claims she was stolen from him by raiders. He offers a great reward for her return and promises terrible vengeance on any who harbor her. Freya's face went white. He disowned me. He cast me out when I refused the marriage he had arranged. Apparently, he has reconsidered. Perhaps the prospect of grandchildren has softened his heart. Or perhaps he simply cannot bear the thought of his bloodline mixing with that of his enemies. Either way, Thorvald added, his claim gives legal weight to demands that might otherwise be ignored. If he chooses to invoke the old laws, to claim blood price for the theft of his daughter, no one stole me, Freya said fiercely. I left of my own choice. I chose Stenr, chose this life, chose to follow my own heart rather than my father's ambitions. But can you prove it? The law speaker's question was gentle, almost kind, but it struck like a physical blow. Can you prove that you came here willingly, that no threats were made, no coercion used? Because if you cannot, then by law you are stolen property that must be returned. Stenr moved to stand beside Freya, his presence solid and reassuring despite the chaos swirling around them. She is not property. She is a free woman who made a free choice. A choice that has brought consequences none of us can escape, Eriksson said heavily. Magnus has allies, warriors, who owe him debts of blood and honor. If he chooses to come for his daughter, he will not come alone. And if he discovers the true reason for her presence here, he will have all the justification he needs to destroy this village and everyone in it, Thorvald finished. The laws are clear on such matters. A man may claim blood vengeance for the defilement of his daughter, especially by one who shares her blood. The room fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the shutters and the distant cry of gulls over the fjord. The scroll lay before them like a map to a treasure that could never be claimed, its careful lines connecting them to a truth that would destroy everything they had built together. Freya looked at Stenr, seeing her own desperation reflected in his eyes. They had found love in impossible circumstances, had built something beautiful in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving world. But love alone might not be enough to protect them from the storm that was coming. What do you counsel? Stenr asked finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil Freya could see raging behind his eyes. Elder Astrid leaned heavily on her walking stick, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. I counsel that you prepare for difficult choices, my boy. I counsel that you consider not just what you want, but what you can live with. And I counsel that you remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. As the village elders filed out of the room, leaving Stenr and Freya alone with their impossible truth, the torn genealogy scroll seemed to mock them from the table. The child stirred again in Freya's womb, and she wondered what kind of world they were bringing it into, a world where love was not enough, where blood ties could be both blessing and curse, where the choices of the heart could bring destruction to everyone they held dear. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the fjord, and the first drops of rain began to fall like tears from an unforgiving sky. The days following the revelation passed like stones thrown into dark water, each one creating ripples that spread outward through the village, until no corner remained untouched by whispers and sideways glances. Freya found herself increasingly isolated. The women who had once nodded politely now crossing themselves when she passed, as if her very presence might bring down the wrath of angry gods. She sat now in the small herb garden behind their quarters, her hands working automatically to sort the dried plants she had gathered before everything changed. The familiar motions, separating stems from leaves, crushing seeds between her fingers to release their oils, brought a measure of peace to her troubled mind. At her side lay Stenr's hunting horn, carved from the tusk of a great walrus he had slain during his first voyage to the northern seas. The intricate patterns etched into its surface told the story of that hunt, of a young warrior proving himself worthy of his father's legacy. "You should not be out here alone," came a voice from behind her. Freya turned to see Solveig approaching, the blacksmith's wife, carrying a basket of mending and wearing an expression that was less hostile than it had been in recent days. "I am not alone," Freya replied, gesturing to her rounded belly. "I have constant company." Solveig settled herself on a wooden stool with a grunt of effort, her weathered hands already reaching for needle and thread. "A child is poor protection against the tongues of angry villagers. There are some who say your presence here brings bad luck, that the poor fishing and late spring are signs of divine displeasure. And what do you say?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, her needle flashing in the afternoon light as she worked to repair a torn tunic. "I say that fishing has always been uncertain, and spring has always come late to these northern lands. I say that people find omens in clouds when they need someone to blame for their troubles." Despite everything, Freya felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "That is not what you said when I first arrived." "No," Solveig admitted. "When you first arrived, I saw only another complication in an already difficult world. But I have watched you these past weeks. I have seen how you tend the sick children without being asked, how you share your knowledge of healing herbs with our healers, how you carry yourself with dignity even when others show you none. Yet you still think I should leave." Solveig's hands stilled on her mending. "I think you should consider what is best for everyone involved, including that child you carry. A mother's first duty is to protect her young, even if that protection requires great sacrifice." Before Freya could respond, hoofbeats echoed across the village. Both women looked up to see riders cresting the hill, the red and gold banners of the Ironhold clan unmistakable even at distance. "Your father's men," Solveig said quietly. Freya's hand went to the hunting horn. "Remembering Stenr's words, if danger comes and I am not beside you, sound this horn. I will hear it wherever I am, and I will come." "Only 3 riders," Freya observed. "If my father meant force, he would send more men. Perhaps he thinks 3 will be enough." The riders approached at measured pace. Freya recognized the leader immediately, Ulf Ironsides, her father's most trusted warrior. Stenr emerged from the great hall as they entered the courtyard, Bloodbane at his side. Villagers gathered, sensing these visitors brought change. "Ulf Ironsides," Stenr called out, "you are far from home." The older warrior dismounted carefully, his pale eyes taking in every detail. When his gaze found Freya, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Stenr Hjalmarsson," he replied. "I bear words from Magnus Ironhold concerning his daughter and the child she carries." "Freya is no longer Magnus's daughter," Stenr said firmly. She chose to leave his house. Her father has no claim, does he not? Ulf smiled grimly. What do you know of old laws regarding stolen daughters? I know no daughter was stolen. Freya came of her own free will. Ah, but the law becomes interesting. Ulf withdrew a sealed scroll. Magnus has made inquiries. Traders tell stories of a great warrior who rescued a maiden from bandits, brought her to his home for healing. Freya's heart sank, realizing where this led. The story was true. Stenr had rescued her that terrible winter. But it could be made to sound like something different. The law is clear, Ulf continued formally. A woman found in distress, given shelter and protection. Such a woman is under that man's authority until proper arrangements are made. If she bears a child during that time, the child belongs to the man who sheltered her. Stenr's hand moved to Bloodbane's handle. You twist the truth. I speak the law as written since our grandfather's time. Magnus claims his daughter was taken by deception, convinced to abandon duty through false promises. He demands her return along with the child, and if we refuse... Jarl Eriksson had appeared beside Stenr. Ulf's pale eyes, met the Jarls directly. Then Magnus seeks justice through other means. He has sent word to the High Thing requesting judgment. If they rule in his favor, and law suggests they will, then any who stand between a father and his stolen daughter face consequences. The threat hung in the air like smoke, its message clear. Magnus wasn't merely seeking his daughter's return, he was laying groundwork for legal war that could destroy Grimhalt. Freya rose slowly, one hand pressed to her back where her growing child caused discomfort. The hunting horn remained clutched in her other hand as she walked toward the courtyard, every eye turning to her. Uncle Ulf, she said quietly, using the formal address from childhood. Tell my father I will not return to be bartered like livestock. I've made my choice, and will live with consequences. Ulf's expression grew sad, the look of a man who had watched a beloved child grow, only to see her choose a path leading away from everything he held dear. Child, he said gently, some choices cannot be unmade. Some paths lead only to sorrow. Your father offers forgiveness, offers to welcome you home and raise your child as his grandchild. All you need do is come with me now, before this grows beyond peaceful resolution. But Freya had already chosen the moment she looked into Stener's eyes and saw her own determination reflected there. Whatever came next, whatever price they would pay for their forbidden love, they would face it together. Tell my father, she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard, that his daughter died the day she chose love over law. The woman before you belongs to no man but the one she chose for herself. The evening fire crackled in the hearth of their small dwelling, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Stenr sat at the wooden table, carefully cleaning and oiling Bloodbane's twin blades, while Freya mended a torn cloak by lamplight. Between them lay a simple silver arm ring, inscribed with ancient runes that bound two souls in marriage, not blessed by priests or witnessed by crowds, but sacred nonetheless in the eyes of those who wore matching bands. They had exchanged the rings 3 nights after Ulf's departure, in a quiet ceremony attended only by the moon and their own whispered vows. The silver had been a gift from Bjorn, melted down from old jewelry and reformed with the skill that had made his reputation. The blacksmith had asked no questions about the propriety of the union, offering only his blessing and the quiet assurance that some bonds transcended law. He will not give up easily, Freya said, her needle flashing in the firelight. My father is not a man who accepts defeat, especially when his honor is at stake. Stenr tested the edge of his axe with his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood that he wiped away without concern. Neither am I. Magnus may have the law on his side, but law means nothing without the strength to enforce it. And if he brings that strength? If he comes with warriors and siege engines, what then? Will you ask this village to bleed for our choices? The question hung between them, like a blade balanced on its edge. Since Ulf's visit, the mood in Grimhalt had grown increasingly tense. Some villagers openly questioned whether harboring the pregnant woman was worth the risk of war, while others whispered that perhaps the gods themselves were displeased with the union of siblings. even half-siblings who had not known their connection. "The village council meets tomorrow," Stenr said, setting down his weapon. "Jarl Eriksson has called for a formal discussion of our situation." Freya's hands stilled on her mending. "A discussion or a judgment?" "Both, I fear. The Jarl is a practical man. He weighs the good of the many against the desires of the few. If he believes our presence threatens the safety of his people, a knock at their door interrupted his words. Stenr rose smoothly, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon's handle, but the voice that called out was familiar and unthreatening. "Peace, my friend. It is only old Einar." The door opened to admit a man whose 80 winters had bent his back but sharpened his mind. Einar the Skald had served 3 generations of Jarls, his memory holding more history than any written scroll. His arrival meant news, and in times like these, news was rarely welcome. "Honored Skald," Freya said, rising to offer him the chair closest to the fire. "What brings you out in the cold night?" Einar accepted the seat gratefully, his joints creaking like old ship timbers. From beneath his heavy cloak, he withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal against metal, silver coins by their sound. "More than a poor Skald should possess. Word has come from the eastern settlements," he said without preamble. "Magnus Ironhold has been gathering allies, promising gold and glory to any who will stand with him when he comes for his daughter." Stenr sat back down heavily. "How many?" 24 warriors, perhaps 3. "Enough to take this village if they catch us unprepared, but not enough for a prolonged siege." "Magnus is counting on a quick resolution. Either we surrender his daughter willingly, or he takes her by force before help can arrive." Freya placed a protective hand over her belly, where her child seemed to stir restlessly, as if sensing the tension that filled the room. "When?" "Soon. The spring thaw has made the roads passable, and Magnus grows impatient. His messengers speak of dishonor that burns like acid in his chest, of a daughter whose defiance has made him a laughingstock among his peers." The silver coins clinked again as Einar set the pouch on the table. "He has also offered gold for information about his daughter's condition, about the child she carries, about any weaknesses in our defenses. There are some in this village who find silver more compelling than loyalty." The words struck like physical blows. To know that friends and neighbors might betray them for coin was a wound that cut deeper than any blade. Stenr had fought beside some of these people, had bled with them in battles against common enemies. Now they might sell his happiness for the price of a few good meals. "Who?" The question came out as a growl. "That I will not say. But be warned, trust carefully, and keep your own counsel. Walls have ears, and desperate people make dangerous choices." Einar rose to leave, but Freya stopped him with a gentle touch on his sleeve. "Wait. You said Magnus offers gold for information, but you speak as one who has already heard much. Why do you bring us warning instead of taking his silver?" The old Skald's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Child, I have lived through 8 decades of human folly, and I have learned that some stories are worth more than gold. Your tale, 2 hearts that found each other across the divide of warring clans, love that survived the revelation of shared blood, the courage to choose happiness over convention. This is a saga worthy of the old heroes." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Besides, I knew your grandmother, Freya Magnusdottir. She too chose love over duty, though her story ended differently than yours may. She would be proud to see her blood running strong in your veins." After the Skald departed, Stenr and Freya sat in contemplative silence. The fire burned lower, casting deeper shadows, and the silver ring on the table seemed to catch and hold what light remained. "Perhaps we should leave," Freya said finally. "Take ship to distant lands where no one knows our names or our history. Start fresh somewhere the old laws cannot reach us, and abandon our child to a life of exile. To grow up as strangers in a strange land, never knowing the songs of their ancestors or the stories of their people." Stenr shook his head. "No, if we run now, we will run forever. Better to make our stand here, among people who know our worth, even if that stand costs us everything. Everything we have is already at risk." Our love, our child, our future, all of it hangs in the balance regardless of what we choose. At least here, we face our enemies with weapons in our hands and friends at our backs. Freya nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as she feared their implications. Outside, wind howled through the village streets like the voices of restless spirits. And somewhere in that sound, she heard an echo of the storms to come. She picked up the silver ring from the table, feeling its weight and the warmth left by Stenar's touch. Such a simple thing, to hold such significance, a circle of metal that represented promises made and commitments sworn. In the old stories, heroes faced impossible odds for love of their kin, their honor, or their homeland. Now she and Stenr faced those same odds for love of each other. "Tomorrow, then," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger, where it caught the firelight like a star. "We face the village council and learn whether we stand alone or with allies." "Not alone," Stenr said firmly, covering her hand with his. "Never alone. Whatever comes, we face it together." The fire settled into glowing embers, and outside the wind continued its restless song. Tomorrow would bring the council's judgment, and with it the first real test of their resolve. But tonight they had each other, and the quiet strength that came from knowing they had chosen their path with open eyes and willing hearts. The great hall had never felt smaller than it did on that grey morning, when the village council convened to decide their fate. Stenr stood beside Freya in the center of the room, surrounded by the carved pillars that had witnessed generations of difficult decisions. Above them, smoke from the central hearth drifted toward the roof hole, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and the weight of unspoken fears. Jarl Eriksson sat in his high seat, flanked by the village elders, whose weathered faces revealed nothing of their thoughts. To his right sat Elder Astrid, her gnarled hands folded over her walking stick, her sharp eyes missing no detail of the proceedings. Thorvald the law speaker occupied a place of honor near the fire, a leather-bound tome of ancient laws resting on his lap like a sleeping serpent. Before them all, displayed on a wooden stand, lay a ship's compass made of polished bronze and etched with protective runes, a relic from the great explorer Leif the Far-Travelled, who had sailed beyond the edge of known maps and returned to tell of lands where the sun never set. The compass had guided ships through fog and storm, had pointed true north when all other landmarks failed. Now it would guide them through the storm of human judgment. "We gather today," Jarl Eriksson began, his voice carrying the formal cadences of legal pronouncement, "to consider a matter that touches not only the lives of two individuals, but the safety and honor of our entire community." Murmurs rippled through the assembled villagers like wind across water. Some faces showed sympathy, others concern. Still others, the hard calculation of people weighing personal safety against abstract principles. Freya felt their judgment pressing against her like a physical weight. But she kept her chin raised and her hand steady on the silver ring that bound her to Stenr. "Stenr Hjalmarsson," the Jarl continued, "you have served this village with honor for 20 years. Your courage in battle is unquestioned, your loyalty proven in blood and sacrifice. Yet now you ask us to risk everything for a choice that flies in the face of law, custom, and divine will." "I ask for nothing but the right to protect my family," Stenr replied, his voice steady, despite the tension that radiated from his massive frame. "Freya came to me in need, and I gave her shelter. She stayed by choice, and I will not force her to leave." "Pretty words," called out Gunnar the trader, a thin man whose sharp features reflected his sharp practices. "But words don't stop arrows when Magnus comes calling. What protection can you offer this village against a force 3 times our number?" "The same protection I have always offered. My life, my strength, my weapon in service of our people. 1 man against 30? Gunnar's laugh held no humor. "Even the great Stenr Hjalmarsson cannot work miracles." Elder Astrid tapped her walking stick against the floor, demanding attention. When silence fell, she spoke in the careful tones of one whose words carried the weight of decades. "There is more at stake here than the lives of 2 lovers," she said. There is the question of what we become if we abandon those who seek our protection. There is the matter of whether we bow to threats or stand firm in our convictions. And there is the matter, Thorvald interjected, of whether we allow forbidden unions to flourish in our midst. Inviting the wrath of the gods upon all our heads, he opened his leather tome, its pages crackling like autumn leaves. The law is ancient and clear. The marriage of siblings, even half-siblings, is an abomination that brings curse upon any community that tolerates it. The children of such unions are marked by madness, their very existence a violation of natural order. Freya stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement that followed the law speaker's words. And what of children born in ignorance? What of love that grew from shared hardship, from mutual respect? From the meeting of kindred souls who knew nothing of shared blood until it was too late to matter. Ignorance does not absolve sin, Thorvald replied coldly. The gods see all, know all. They guided your steps together precisely to test your wisdom, your restraint, your devotion to higher law. You have failed that test, have we? Stenar's voice carried a challenge that made several villagers shift uncomfortably. Or have we passed a different test entirely, the test of loyalty, of courage, of the willingness to stand for what we believe regardless of cost? Bjorn the blacksmith rose from his seat near the back of the hall, his massive frame commanding attention. I have watched these two for months now, he said, his voice rough from years of shouting over the sound of hammer on anvil. I have seen how they care for each other, how they serve this community, how they face adversity with dignity and grace. If this is what cursed love looks like, then perhaps we need to reconsider our understanding of curses. His words sparked a dozen conversations at once, voices rising in agreement and opposition, until Jarl Eriksson was forced to call for order. The bronze compass seemed to catch the firelight, its polished surface reflecting the dancing flames, like a mirror showing glimpses of possible futures. The question before us, Eriksson said when quiet returned, is not whether we approve of this union. The question is whether we will stand against Magnus Ironhold when he comes to reclaim what he considers his property. She is not property, Stenr growled, his hand moving instinctively to Bloodbane's handle. She is a free woman who made a free choice. According to Magnus, she is a stolen daughter whose seducer must pay the price of his crime. According to the old laws, he has the right to seek blood compensation for the dishonor done to his family. And according to our laws, Elder Astrid said firmly, we do not surrender guests to their enemies without cause. Freya came to us seeking protection, and we granted it. To cast her out now would be a violation of hospitality older than any written code. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against a rocky shore. Some spoke of honor, others of practicality. Some invoked the gods, others appealed to human compassion. Through it all, Freya stood silent, her hand pressed protectively over her belly, where her child grew larger each day. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and cast a shaft of light through the roof hole to illuminate the bronze compass, Jarl Eriksson called for a formal vote. The compass needle seemed to tremble in the firelight, seeking true north in a world where direction had become uncertain. All who would stand with Stenr and Freya, who would offer them the protection of this village regardless of the cost. Raise your hands. Hands rose throughout the hall, not all, but enough. Elder Astrid's gnarled fingers reached toward the roof beams, followed by Bjorn's massive fist, then Einar the Skald's weathered hand. Others followed, until nearly half the assembly had declared themselves willing to face Magnus Ironhold's wrath, and all who would counsel them to depart, who would seek peace through separation. More hands rose, including Thorvald's pale fingers and Gunnar's grasping palm. The count was close enough to leave doubt and division in its wake. Jarl Eriksson studied the divided hall for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the weight of leadership in dark times. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a man who had made his choice and would live with its consequences. The vote is too close for certainty, too divided for peace. Therefore I invoke my right as Jarl to cast the deciding voice." He paused, letting the weight of his decision settle over the hall like snow. "Stenr Hjalmarsson and Freya Magnusdottir will remain under the protection of this village. If Magnus Ironhold wishes to challenge that protection, let him come. We will give him the fight he seeks." The weeks following the council's decision transformed Grimhalt from a peaceful fishing village into an armed camp. Every able-bodied man and woman worked from dawn to dusk, strengthening defenses, sharpening weapons, and preparing for a siege that might come at any moment. The sound of hammers rang constantly from Bjorn's forge as he crafted spearheads and arrow points, while the women wove bowstrings and stitched leather armor with grim determination. At the heart of these preparations stood a battle standard that had not been seen in 20 years, the Raven Banner of Grimhalt. Its blackbird worked in silver thread against a field of deep blue. The standard had flown over victories against Danish raiders and Swedish warbands, had witnessed the glory days when Grimhalt's longships struck fear into the hearts of enemies across the northern seas. Now it hung from the great hall's highest beam, waiting to inspire another generation of warriors. Freya found herself caught between gratitude and guilt as she watched the village transform around her. These people were risking everything for her sake, preparing to face death because she and Stenr had chosen love over law. Her pregnancy had advanced enough that she could no longer hide the swell of her belly, and every movement reminded her of the life growing within her, the child whose very existence had sparked this crisis. "You cannot blame yourself for their choices," Stenr said, as they stood together on the wooden ramparts that now crowned the village walls. Below them, children too young to fight played at being warriors, their wooden swords flashing in the afternoon sun, while their mothers watched with eyes that held too much knowledge of what real battle looked like. "Can I not? If I had left when Ulf first came, if I had returned to my father's hall, you would have been traded to some ambitious jarl like a prize mare, and our child would have grown up never knowing its true father." Stenar's voice carried the hard edge of certainty. Magnus would have found another excuse for war eventually. Men like him always do. "At least this way, we fight for something that matters." A horn's blast echoed across the valley, long and mournful like the cry of a dying whale. Both Stenr and Freya tensed, hands moving instinctively to weapons that had become constant companions. But the sound came from their own watchtower, not from approaching enemies, the signal that meant messengers approached under a flag of truce. They descended from the walls to find the village square already filling with curious onlookers. Jarl Eriksson emerged from the great hall wearing his finest mail shirt and the golden arm rings that marked his rank, while Elder Astrid took her place beside him with ceremonial dignity. The Raven Banner hung between them, its silver threads catching the light like prophecy made manifest. The messengers who rode through the gates were not common warriors, but men of importance, their horses well-bred and their equipment expensive. At their head rode a figure that made Freya's breath catch in her throat, Harald Ironhold, her eldest brother, tall and golden-haired like their father, but with gentler eyes that had always shown her kindness in the harsh world of clan politics. "Sister," Harald said as he dismounted, his voice carrying across the square with careful neutrality. "You look well, considering your circumstances." "Brother," Freya stepped forward despite Stenr's protective gesture, "I had hoped never to see you again for both our sakes." Harald's smile held more sadness than joy. "Father sends his greetings and his final offer. Return with me now, willingly, and he will welcome you home with full honors. Your child will be raised as a legitimate grandchild, given lands and title befitting noble blood. Your companion will be allowed to leave unharmed, with gold enough to start a new life in distant lands. And if I refuse, then Magnus Ironhold comes with sword and fire to reclaim what was stolen from him. 36 warriors follow his banner, and more gather each day. They will not be turned aside by wooden walls and brave words." Jarl Eriksson stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt with casual menace. "And what message does your father send to me, Harald Ironhold?" What words for the man who gives his daughter sanctuary? Harold's expression grew formal, the mask of diplomacy sliding over his features like armor. He sends word that you harbor a thief and a defiler, that you give aid to one who has violated the most sacred laws of blood and kinship. Stand aside, and he will remember Grimhalt as a friend. Continue this folly, and he will remember you as an enemy. I see. Ericsson's voice carried the dry humor of a man who had faced impossible odds before. And does your father remember the time Grimhalt's warriors stood with him against the Danish fleet? Does he recall how our ships helped break the siege of his own stronghold 5 summers past? He remembers old friendship, which is why he offers this chance for peace. But friendship has limits, and some insults cannot be overlooked. The conversation continued in the formal patterns of diplomatic negotiation, but Freya found her attention drifting to the faces around the square. Some watched with open hostility, resenting her for bringing this crisis upon their heads. Others showed sympathy, perhaps remembering their own struggles with love and duty. Still others displayed the grim acceptance of people who had chosen their side and would see it through regardless of cost. There is another matter, Harold said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. Father has received word from the High Thing. They have agreed to hear his case, to judge whether his daughter was stolen and what compensation should be paid. The news struck like a physical blow. The High Thing was the greatest legal assembly in the northern lands, where jarls and law speakers gathered to settle disputes too complex for local resolution. Their judgment would carry the weight of divine authority, binding on all who acknowledged their jurisdiction. When? Thorvald the law speaker asked, his pale face showing professional interest despite the personal implications. The assembly meets at midsummer, 6 weeks hence. Magnus will present his case then, with witnesses and evidence of his daughter's abduction. Unless she returns willingly before that time, the matter will be decided by law rather than negotiation. 6 weeks. Freya's hand went instinctively to her belly, calculating how much larger her child would be by then, how much more vulnerable she would become as birth approached. 6 weeks to find some solution to an impossible situation, or face the judgment of men who had never known the kind of love that defied every law they held sacred. We need time to consider your offer, Jarl Eriksson said finally. Return tomorrow for our answer. Harold nodded, mounting his horse with fluid grace. But before departing, he looked once more at his sister, and in his eyes Freya saw not the hard certainty of a warrior, but the pain of a brother who feared he might never see her alive again. Think carefully, sister, he said softly. Some battles cannot be won, no matter how righteously they are fought. As the messengers departed, the square slowly emptied, leaving Freya and Stenr alone beneath the raven banner. The silver-threaded bird seemed to watch them with ancient eyes, waiting to see whether they would prove worthy of the sacrifices being made in their name. 6 weeks, Freya whispered. 6 weeks to prepare, Stenr replied, his voice carrying the steady resolve that had made him a legend among warriors. 6 weeks to prove that love can triumph over law, that courage can overcome convention. But as they stood together in the lengthening shadows, both wondered whether 6 weeks would be enough to change the course of fate itself. The revelation came not with the clash of weapons or the thunder of hoofbeats, but in the quiet whisper of an old woman's dying breath. Elder Astrid had taken ill 3 days after Harold's visit, a sudden fever that left her bedridden and speaking in fragments of memory that seemed to drift between past and present. Freya had been tending to her, using the healing skills learned from her mother. When the elder's weathered hand grasped hers with surprising strength, the birth cloth, Astrid whispered, her eyes bright with fever but sharp with purpose.
Hidden?
Beneath the hearthstone, in my cottage. Find it, child. Find it before the truth dies with me. By the time Freya had summoned help, the elder was gone, her final breath released like a secret too long held. The village mourned the loss of their wisest counselor, but Freya could think only of the cryptic words and the urgency in those fading eyes. That night, while the village prepared Astrid's funeral pyre, she and Stenr crept through the darkness to the elder's small cottage. The hearthstone was massive, requiring both their strength to shift it even slightly. Beneath lay a wooden box wrapped in oiled leather, preserved against time and moisture. Inside, nested like a sleeping bird, was a piece of cloth unlike any Freya had ever seen. Silk dyed the deep blue of midnight sky, embroidered with silver threads that formed intricate patterns of wolves and ravens. But it was not the cloth's beauty that made her hands tremble as she lifted it to the lamplight. It was the bloodstains, ancient and brown but still clearly visible, and the runic inscription worked into the border in letters too small to read without careful study. As her eyes traced the ancient symbols, the meaning became clear, and with it came a truth that shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. "This is a birth cloth," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the close confines of the cottage, used to wrap newborn children of royal blood. "The runes. Stenr, the runes tell the date of birth, the parentage, the lineage." Stenr leaned closer, his warrior's eyes struggling with the intricate script. "What do they say?" "They say this cloth wrapped a daughter born to Ragnar Ironhold and—" She paused, her finger tracing the symbols with growing disbelief. "And Thorstein the Wanderer, not Hjalm the Bold. Thorstein, who died in the Eastern Wars before his daughter could know him." The implications crashed over them like a cold wave. If Freya was not Hjalm's daughter, if her true father was Thorstein the Wanderer, then she and Stenr shared no blood at all. The forbidden nature of their love, the sin that had driven them into exile and brought war to Grimhalt's gates, was built on a lie that had shaped 2 lives and threatened to destroy an entire village. But how? Stenr asked, his voice rough with confusion and dawning hope. "How could such a thing be hidden? Why would your mother claim Hjalm as your father if Thorstein—" "Because Thorstein was dead," Freya said, understanding flooding through her like sunrise after the longest night. "Because a dead man cannot protect his daughter or provide for her future. Because Hjalm the Bold was alive and powerful, and a winter of passion between enemy clans created opportunity for both deception and survival." They sat in stunned silence. The birth cloth spread between them like a map to a different world. Outside, the sounds of funeral preparation continued, the gathering of wood for the pyre, the weaving of flowers for the death garlands, the soft chanting of women who sang the old songs to ease a soul's journey to the afterlife. "She knew," Freya whispered finally. "Elder Astrid knew the truth all along. She was present at my birth, helped my mother through the labor. She saw this cloth wrap me, heard my mother's confession in the pain of childbirth. She kept the secret for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Why now? Why wait until she was dying to share something that could have saved us months of anguish?" Freya folded the cloth carefully, her hands reverent on the ancient silk. "Because the truth alone is not enough. We needed to prove ourselves first, needed to show that our love was worth fighting for regardless of law or blood. If we had known from the beginning that we were not siblings, our choice would have been easy, comfortable. There would have been no test of our devotion, no measure of our courage." The next morning brought chaos to the village as word of the discovery spread. Thorvald, the law speaker, studied the birth cloth with the intensity of a scholar examining holy scripture, his pale fingers tracing the runic inscriptions while other learned men peered over his shoulders. The silk's authenticity was undeniable. Its weave spoke of royal workshops, its dyes of imperial expense, its preservation of secrets guarded by the most powerful families in the northern lands. "This changes everything," Thorvald declared when his examination was complete. "If Freya is truly the daughter of Thorstein, the Wanderer rather than Hjalm the Bold, then no law has been broken, no taboo violated. The union between her and Stenr Hjalmarsson is not only permissible but advantageous. It binds 2 noble lineages without the taint of shared blood." But even as hope blossomed in Freya's heart, practical concerns arose like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Magnus Ironhold had built his case on the assumption that his daughter had been seduced by her half-brother, that the violation of blood law justified extreme measures. If that foundation crumbled, what would prevent him from simply claiming the birth cloth was a forgery, a desperate deception designed to escape justice? "He will not accept it," Freya said, as she and Stenr walked the village walls in the grey light of dawn. "My father, Magnus, has invested too much in this conflict to simply admit he was wrong. His honor, his reputation, his standing among the other jarls, all of it depends on maintaining that I was stolen and defiled. Then we must find a way to make him accept it. The High Thing will examine the cloth, verify its authenticity through their own scholars and law speakers. If we can present the truth before that assembly, if we survive long enough to reach it." Freya's hand went to her belly, where her child grew larger each day. "I am 7 months gone now. Travel to the High Thing would be dangerous, and Magnus may not wait for legal resolution. He may choose to settle this matter with steel rather than law, as if summoned by her words." The watchman's horn sounded from the highest tower, not the long blast that announced messengers, but the sharp, urgent notes that meant armed men approached. Stena's hand went immediately to Bloodbane's handle as they hurried toward the walls, joining the stream of villagers who rushed to see what new threat emerged from the morning mist. The force that crested the hill was larger than expected, nearly 50 warriors, riding under the red and gold banners of the Ironhold clan, with Magnus himself visible at their head. His armor gleamed like silver in the pale sunlight, and his presence radiated the controlled fury of a man who had come to settle accounts in blood. But it was not Magnus who commanded Freya's attention as the army approached. Riding beside her father, her adoptive father, she reminded herself, was a figure that made her heart sink with despair. Einar the Skald, the old storyteller who had warned them of Magnus's plans, who had spoken so eloquently of love and loyalty, now rode with their enemies under a white banner of truce. "He betrayed us," someone whispered from the walls. "The old snake took Magnus's gold after all." But as Freya watched the approaching riders, she saw something in Einar's posture that spoke not of betrayal, but of desperate purpose. The Skald carried himself like a man, bearing a burden too heavy for his ancient shoulders, and when he looked toward the village walls, his expression held not triumph, but profound sadness. "No," she said softly, understanding beginning to dawn like light through storm clouds. "He did not betray us. He carries the birth cloth's twin, the proof that will either save us or damn us all." The game had changed once again, but whether fortune smiled or frowned upon them remained to be seen. As Magnus Ironhold's army deployed for siege, the truth hung in the balance like a sword, suspended by a thread, waiting to fall and determine the fate of everyone caught in its shadow. The parley took place at midday, when the sun stood highest and shadows fell shortest, a time chosen by ancient tradition to prevent deception and ensure that all words spoken would be witnessed clearly by gods and men alike. Between the village walls and Magnus's battle line, a circle of stones had been hastily erected, creating neutral ground where enemies could meet without the immediate threat of violence. Magnus Ironhold sat his warhorse like a king upon a throne, his presence commanding even in the simple act of existing. Age had silvered his beard and lined his face, but his shoulders remained broad beneath his mail, and his pale eyes held the cold fire that had made him feared throughout the northern lands. Beside him rode Harold, his golden son, whose expression showed the strain of serving as both warrior and diplomat in a conflict that could destroy his family, regardless of its outcome. Einar the Skald sat apart from both groups, his ancient frame bent beneath the weight of secrets, and his weathered hands clutching a leather satchel that seemed to hold more than mere documents. When the wind shifted, Freya could smell the scent of old parchment and older truths, mysteries preserved through decades of careful guardianship. "Stenr Hjalmarsson," Magnus called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "You stand accused of theft, seduction, and the defilement of noble blood. What answer do you make to these charges?" "I answer that no theft occurred where a gift was freely given," Stenr replied, his own voice steady despite the 40 spear points aimed at his heart. I answer that no seduction took place where love grew from mutual respect and shared hardship. As for defilement, he gestured toward Freya, who stood beside him with one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Look upon the woman you call defiled, Magnus Ironhold. Does she appear broken to you? Does she seem diminished by the love she has chosen? Or does she stand before you with the dignity of one who has made her own path in this world? Magnus's gaze shifted to his daughter, his adopted daughter, Freya reminded herself, and for a moment his expression softened almost imperceptibly. But the moment passed, like a cloud across the sun, leaving behind only the hard resolve of a man who had committed too much to turn back now. She stands before me, heavy with bastard child, cast out from decent society, the subject of songs that will shame our family's name for generations. If this is what you call dignity, then we have different understandings of the word. Perhaps we do, Freya stepped forward, ignoring Stenr's protective gesture. Perhaps you understand dignity as the ability to bow to others' expectations, to sacrifice personal happiness for political advantage, to treat daughters like livestock, to be traded for alliance and gold. I understand dignity as the courage to choose love over convenience, truth over comfort, hope over fear. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his eyes reflecting the internal struggle of a man caught between loyalty to his father and love for his sister. Freya, he said gently, this does not have to end in bloodshed. Father offers you one final chance to come home, to raise your child in safety and honor. All you need do is renounce this union, and return to the family that loves you. But that is exactly what I cannot do. Freya's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Because this union is not the sin you believe it to be. Because the child I carry is not the cursed offspring of forbidden blood. Because the entire foundation of your accusations rests upon a lie that has shaped 2 lives and threatens to destroy countless others. She nodded toward Einar, who rose slowly from his position between the opposing forces. The old Skald's hands shook as he opened his leather satchel, withdrawing not 1 but 2 pieces of ancient silk, birth cloths that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light as they caught the midday sun. Magnus Ironhold, Einar's voice carried despite his age, trained by decades of speaking to crowded halls and hostile audiences. You have built your case upon the assumption that Freya is your blood daughter, sired by Hjalm the Bold during a winter of truce between your clans. But what if that assumption is false? What if the truth is more complex than the simple story you have told yourself? Magnus's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. Old man, choose your words carefully. I was present at my daughter's birth, saw her draw her first breath, welcomed her into my household with joy and pride. You were present, yes. But were you present for the conversation that took place between Ragnar and myself in the hours before her labor began? Were you there when your beloved wife confessed that the child she carried was not Hjalm's Get, but the daughter of Thorstein the Wanderer, gotten during his final visit to your lands before riding east to his death? The words fell into absolute silence, like stones dropped into a still pond, their ripples spreading outward through both armies until every warrior, every villager, every witness to this confrontation understood the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Magnus dismounted slowly, his movements mechanical as shock worked through his system like poison. Ragnar would never. She loved me, was faithful to me, bore me 3 sons and 1 daughter who was not yours by blood, though you raised her as your own with all the love a father could give. Einar spread the birth cloths on a flat stone where all could see them. These are the proofs, Magnus. The first wrapped your daughter at her birth, recording Thorstein as her true father. The second I have carried for 30 years, waiting for the day when truth would serve a greater purpose than comfortable lies. Thorvald the law speaker approached the stone with careful steps, his scholarly training overcoming his personal involvement in the conflict. He examined both cloths with meticulous attention, comparing their weaves, their dyes, their runic inscriptions with the eye of a man who had studied such documents throughout his career. "The silks are authentic," he announced finally. "Royal weave, imperial dyes, runic work that matches the style of the period. The blood upon them is ancient but genuine, and the inscriptions are consistent with birth records of that era. If these are forgeries, they are the work of masters beyond any skill I have encountered." Magnus stood frozen beside his horse, his mind clearly struggling to process a truth that demolished not only his legal case, but his understanding of his own family. Harold dismounted to stand beside his father, one hand resting gently on the older man's shoulder in a gesture of support that transcended the political implications of the moment. "If this is true," Magnus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "then I have wronged both my daughter and the man she chose. I have brought war to innocent people based upon a misunderstanding that cost my beloved wife the truth she died protecting. The truth she died protecting was her daughter's future," Einar said gently. "Thorstein was dead, his lineage extinct, his wealth scattered to the winds. Hjalm the Bold could provide for a child, could give her the advantages that noble birth should bring. Your wife chose to let you believe what would serve her daughter best, even at the cost of carrying that secret to her grave." Freya felt tears running down her cheeks as she finally understood the full measure of her birth mother's sacrifice. Ragnar had given up the truth to secure her daughter's future, had allowed her husband to claim paternal pride for a child who was not his, had carried the burden of deception out of love for people she would never live to see grown. "What happens now?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the practical concerns of a man trying to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of certainty. "Father has brought 40 warriors to reclaim a daughter who was never stolen, to punish a crime that was never committed. How do we explain this to the men who followed us here, expecting battle and glory?" Magnus straightened slowly, his warrior's training reasserting itself as he grappled with the new reality. "We tell them the truth. We tell them that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when not to fight, that the highest honor comes from admitting error and making amends." He turned toward Freya, his pale eyes reflecting a mixture of pain, pride, and something that might have been hope. "Daughter, for you will always be my daughter, regardless of blood. Can you forgive a foolish old man who let pride overcome wisdom, who almost destroyed what he should have protected?" Freya crossed the neutral ground between them, her steps careful on the uneven stones, but her purpose clear. When she reached Magnus, she placed her hands on either side of his weathered face, looking into the eyes that had watched her grow from infant to woman. "There is nothing to forgive, Father. You acted from love, even if that love was misdirected. You sought to protect my honor, even when I no longer wanted that protection. How can I blame you for caring too much rather than too little?" Magnus pulled her into an embrace that was both gentle and fierce, his arms careful of her pregnant condition, but desperate in their need to hold close what he had nearly lost forever. Around them, 2 armies watched in silence as love conquered law, as truth dissolved the lies that had driven them to the brink of war. But even as hope blossomed in Freya's heart, she knew their trials were not over. The child growing within her would still need to be born, still need to find its place in a world that had questioned its very right to exist. The village of Grimhalt would still need to deal with the consequences of their choice to harbor fugitive lovers. And somewhere in the distance, the High Thing waited to pass judgment on a case that had suddenly become far more complex than anyone had imagined. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the circle of stones, where truth had finally emerged from the darkness of decades-old secrets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of the bonds that connected them all. But for now, in this moment of revelation and reconciliation, it was enough to know that love had found a way to triumph over the lies that had nearly destroyed it. The celebration that night in Grimhalt's great hall carried the wild joy of people who had stared death in the face and lived to laugh about it. Magnus's warriors sat beside Grimhalt's defenders, sharing ale and stories as if they had been brothers in arms rather than enemies poised for battle just hours before. The air rang with laughter and song, the ancient melodies that bound communities together in times of triumph and sorrow. But beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of tension that the wisest among them could feel like a coming storm. Truth had been revealed and reconciliation achieved, but the child growing in Freya's womb cared nothing for politics or convenient timing. As the night wore on, she found herself gripping Stenr's hand with increasing frequency, her breathing growing shallow as waves of discomfort washed over her with regularity that spoke of nature's own schedule. "It is time," she whispered to him during a lull in the feast, her voice barely audible above the noise of celebration. "The child will not wait for morning." Stenr's face went pale beneath his weathered tan, the color of a man who had faced countless enemies without flinching, but found himself unprepared for the mysteries of birth and new life. Around them, the feast continued in blissful ignorance of the drama about to unfold. Warriors and villagers united in their relief that bloodshed had been averted. The women of the village moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had attended many births, their preparations swift and sure as they transformed Stenr and Freya's small dwelling into a birthing chamber. Candles were lit and positioned for maximum light, clean linens were spread across the bed, and water was set to boiling over the hearth. At the center of it all stood the midwife, Helga Ironarm, whose skill in bringing children safely into the world was legendary throughout the northern settlements. "This child chooses an auspicious time," Helga observed, as she examined Freya with gentle competence. "Born on the night when truth conquered lies, when love proved stronger than law. Such timing speaks of a soul eager to meet the world." Magnus paced the narrow confines of the cottage like a caged wolf, his earlier joy at reconciliation now mixed with the anxiety that came with impending grandfatherhood. Harold stood beside the doorway, ready to carry news to the assembled crowds, while Stenr held Freya's hand with the desperate grip of a man who would gladly trade places with her if such things were possible. The birth progressed through the long hours of darkness, each contraction bringing the child closer to its first breath, but testing Freya's strength and resolve. The ancient birth cloth, Thorstein's daughter's cloth, lay spread across a wooden chest, waiting to wrap the newest member of a bloodline that had nearly been lost to misunderstanding and fear. "I can see the head," Helga announced as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "One more push, child. One more effort, and your baby will breathe free air." Freya drew upon reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, her body working with instincts older than civilization as she brought forth the life she and Stenr had created. The cry that emerged from her throat was primal, fierce, triumphant, the sound of a woman claiming victory over pain and uncertainty. The baby's first wail split the morning air like a blade, announcing to the world that Thorstein's bloodline lived on, that love had indeed conquered law, that the impossible had become gloriously, beautifully possible. Helga lifted the child with practiced hands, her weathered face creasing into a smile of pure joy as she examined the small, perfect form. "A daughter," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to those who waited outside. Whole and healthy, with her father's strength and her mother's stubborn spirit already evident in every breath she takes. Magnus stepped forward to look upon his granddaughter, not of his blood, but of his heart, and Freya saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. This man, who had commanded armies and conquered enemies, was utterly conquered himself by the sight of a newborn child whose very existence represented hope for the future. "What will you name her?" he asked softly, his voice rough with emotion. Freya looked up at Stenr, seeing her own wonder reflected in his grey eyes. They had discussed names during the long months of pregnancy, but now that their daughter lay breathing in their arms, those conversations seemed distant and theoretical. This child deserved a name that honored her unique place in their story, her birth on the night when truth triumphed over lies. "Vera," Freya said, the name coming to her lips like a gift from the gods themselves. Her name is Vera, Truth, because she was born in the hour when truth set us all free. As if responding to her name, little Vera opened her eyes for the first time, revealing irises of the deepest blue, like midnight sky reflected in still water. Her tiny fingers grasped at the air, already reaching for a world that had nearly rejected her before she drew breath, already claiming her place in a story that would be told for generations to come. Outside, the celebration took on new meaning as news of the birth spread through the assembled crowds. Warriors who had ridden to battle now raised their cups to toast a child whose existence proved that some victories were worth more than gold or glory, that some truths were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. 3 days after Vera's birth, when mother and child had both proven themselves strong and healthy, the most unexpected visitor in the history of Grimhalt arrived at the village gates. The High King's herald came alone, carrying only a staff topped with golden ravens and wearing the simple traveling clothes of a man who valued speed over ceremony. His presence meant that news of their conflict had reached the highest levels of power. That decisions made in this remote fjord village would now be scrutinized by royal eyes. "I bring greetings from King Harold Fairhair," the herald announced to the assembly gathered in the great hall. "His Majesty has heard of the dispute between Magnus Ironhold and the village of Grimhalt, of the questions raised regarding forbidden blood and stolen daughters. He has also heard of the resolution achieved through the revelation of ancient truths." Magnus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wondering how much of his failed campaign had become royal entertainment. Beside him, Stenr held baby Vera with the careful attention of a new father, still amazed by the miracle of her existence, while Freya recovered her strength day by day with the resilience that had carried her through months of uncertainty. "The king is pleased," the herald continued, "that bloodshed was avoided through wisdom rather than conquest. He is particularly interested in the birth cloths that provided such dramatic proof of paternity, as His Majesty is currently commissioning a great work, a comprehensive genealogy of all the noble houses in his realm." Einar the Skald leaned forward with keen interest. "A royal genealogy? Such a work would require scholars of the highest caliber, men who understand not only the written records, but the oral traditions that preserve truths too dangerous for parchment." Indeed, which is why the king extends an invitation to Einar Truthkeeper, for that is how you will be known henceforth, to join the royal court as chief genealogist and keeper of noble lineages. Your wisdom in preserving and revealing the true parentage of Thorstein's daughter has earned royal recognition. The honor was unprecedented for a village skald. But Einar's weathered face showed more concern than joy. "I am an old man, Herald. My traveling days are behind me, and my loyalties lie with the people who have been my family for 40 years. The king anticipated such devotion. Therefore, he extends his patronage to the entire village of Grimhalt, granting trade privileges and royal protection to ensure that truth speakers may continue their work, without fear of retribution from those who prefer comfortable lies to difficult facts." Jarl Eriksson stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral despite the magnitude of what was being offered. Royal patronage meant prosperity, protection, and prestige beyond anything their small community had ever imagined. It also meant obligations, expectations, and the constant scrutiny that came with high favor. "What does His Majesty require in return for such generosity?" The herald smiled, clearly having expected this question. "The king requires that Grimhalt serve as a center of learning, a place where scholars may come to study the preservation of truth through difficult times. He requires that the story of Stenr and Freya Thorstein's daughter, for by her true lineage shall she now be known, be recorded accurately for future generations." "And of me?" Magnus asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man prepared to face consequences for his actions. "What judgment does the king pass on one who nearly brought war over a misunderstanding?" His Majesty notes that you acted from love of family and concern for honor, motivations that are commendable even when misdirected. He offers you a choice: return to your lands with his forgiveness and a royal recommendation to the other jarls, or accept a position at court as an advisor on matters requiring both warriors' courage and father's wisdom. Magnus glanced at Freya, who nursed little Vera with the serene concentration of new motherhood. The sight of his daughter, his heart's daughter, regardless of blood, content and thriving, seemed to settle something deep in his soul. "I choose my family," he said simply. "My daughter has found her happiness here, among people who value truth and courage over convention. My place is wherever I can protect and support that happiness." "A wise choice," the herald acknowledged. "The king respects family loyalty above all other virtues." As the formal proceedings concluded and the herald prepared to depart with their answers, Freya rose carefully from her chair and approached the man who had shaped so much of her life through love rather than blood. "Father," she said, using the title that meant more now than it ever had before. "Will you stay for Vera's naming ceremony? Will you help us welcome her properly into the world she nearly wasn't allowed to enter?" Magnus's answer came in the form of an embrace that spoke volumes about the bonds that connected them, not the ties of shared blood, but the deeper connections forged through shared struggle, mutual respect, and the kind of love that chose to endure regardless of circumstances. As the sun set over the fjord that night, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of a family gathered around the sacred fire where Vera would receive her name and her place in the community. The child who had been conceived in forbidden love and born in triumphant truth would grow up surrounded by people who understood that the strongest bonds were those chosen freely rather than imposed by fate. 5 years had passed since that momentous night when truth conquered lies and love triumphed over law. Yet the memory remained as vivid as yesterday in the minds of all who had witnessed it. The village of Grimhalt had prospered under royal patronage, growing from a simple fishing settlement into a renowned center of learning, where scholars came from distant lands to study the preservation of historical truth. Vera Stenrsdottir ran through the great hall with the boundless energy of a 5-year-old, her laughter echoing off the carved beams as she chased the village cats between the benches where visiting scholars bent over their manuscripts. Her dark hair caught the firelight as she moved, and her eyes, still that deep midnight blue she had been born with, sparkled with intelligence and mischief in equal measure. "Careful, little one," called Freya from her place near the fire, where she sat mending a tunic while keeping watchful eyes on her energetic daughter. The years had settled on her gently, adding wisdom to her beauty and strength to her spirit. Round her neck, she still wore the carved wolf pendant that had been her mother's. But now it was joined by other tokens, gifts from grateful villagers, symbols of the respect she had earned as a healer and counselor. Stenr looked up from the weapon he was polishing, not bloodbane, which hung in place of honor above their hearth, but a smaller blade meant for teaching young warriors the fundamentals of swordcraft. As Grimhalt's master of arms, he now trained not only the village defenders, but also the sons and daughters of nobles who came to learn both warrior skills and the deeper lessons of honor, courage, and the wisdom that came from making difficult choices. "She has your speed," he observed with fatherly pride, "but my stubbornness. Watch how she refuses to give up, even when the cats climb to places she cannot follow." Near the great hearth, Magnus Ironhold sat in the carved chair that had become his customary place, his silver hair catching the firelight as he supervised a chess game between 2 visiting scholars. Age had gentled him without diminishing his presence, and his role as Grimhalt's unofficial ambassador had proved invaluable in negotiating with the various dignitaries who sought audiences with the famous truth preservers. "Grandfather Magnus," Vera called out, abandoning her pursuit of the cats to climb into his lap with the casual affection of a child who had never known anything but unconditional love. "Tell me again about the night I was born. Tell me about the warriors and the truth cloth and how everybody cried happy tears. Magnus's weathered face creased into the special smile he reserved for his granddaughter, not of his blood, but certainly of his heart. Again, child, I have told that story so many times that the very walls could recite it from memory, but I like how you tell it, Vera insisted with the logic of childhood. You make it sound like a real adventure, with heroes and treasures and everything. It was a real adventure, Magnus said, settling her more comfortably in his lap. It was the adventure of two people brave enough to choose love over law, truth over convenience, hope over fear. And the greatest treasure was you, little star, born on the night when everything changed. From his corner near the fire, Einar the Skald looked up from the manuscript he was copying, part of the great royal genealogy that had become his life's work. His hair was now completely white, but his mind remained sharp as ever, and his position as Grimhalt's chief scholar had brought honor to the entire community. Stories have power, he said, in his cracked but still compelling voice. They shape how we see the world, how we understand our place in it. Vera's story, your story, has already inspired 3 songs, 2 epic poems, and countless retellings around hearthfires throughout the northern lands. Really? Vera's eyes grew wide with wonder. People sing about me? They sing about courage, Freya corrected gently. They sing about the importance of seeking truth, even when it's difficult, about the strength that comes from facing challenges with love and determination. You are part of that song, but so are we all. As evening deepened and the scholars retreated to their quarters, the family gathered around their private hearth for the quiet moments that had become precious routine. Vera curled up between her parents while Magnus settled into his chair nearby, and for a time they simply enjoyed the peace that had been so hard won. Do you ever wonder, Freya asked quietly, what would have happened if Elder Astrid had never hidden that birth cloth? If we had known from the beginning that we shared no blood? Stenr considered the question seriously, as he did all matters that touched on their remarkable journey. I think we would have found each other eventually, he said finally. Perhaps not in the same way, perhaps not with the same intensity, but love like ours doesn't depend on convenience or ease. It finds a way. The testing made it stronger, Magnus added thoughtfully. Easy choices teach us nothing about our own character. It was only by facing the impossible that you discovered what you were truly capable of. Outside, snow began to fall gently over the fjord, the first snowfall of what promised to be a mild winter. The village settled into evening quiet, secure in the knowledge that they were protected not only by strong walls and brave defenders, but by the favor of kings and the respect of scholars throughout the known world. Vera had fallen asleep in her father's arms, her breathing deep and regular, her small hand clutching the toy sword that had been Magnus's gift on her last birthday. Looking at her peaceful face, Freya saw not just her daughter, but the future itself, a generation that would grow up knowing that love could indeed triumph over law, that truth was worth fighting for, that the choices of the heart could reshape the very foundations of the world. Tomorrow, she said softly, Thorvald wants to begin teaching Vera to read the old runes. He says she has the kind of mind that will preserve important things, like her mother, Stenr murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of their daughter's head. Like her grandfather, like all the truth-keepers who came before her. The fire settled into glowing embers, and outside the snow continued its gentle fall, covering the world in pristine white that spoke of new beginnings and infinite possibilities. In the warmth of their home, surrounded by the family they had chosen and fought to keep, Stenr and Freya Thorsteinsdottir knew that they had won more than victory. They had won the right to write their own saga, to create their own legend, to prove that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with swords and ships, but with the simple courage to follow one's heart into the unknown.